friends, welcome back to Food Prep Guide. Today we are talking about how to store dried beans long term. Now inside this tutorial we are going to be covering several aspects. I'll start by showing you the how-tos for storing beans long term, and then I'm going to walk you through my personal rotation system inside my long-term food storage pantry using the 5-gallon bucket method. Then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of things like how to degas your beans, because that's more pleasant for everyone. And then we're going to be talking about how to revive old stale beans. Those are the types of beans that will not soften no matter how long you cook them, but there is a solution to that. And then I'm going to wrap up with showing you a quick way to can your dried beans so that you can use them for super quick meals without any kind of pre-soaking and going through all of those steps. Okay, let's go ahead and jump in and start with the how-tos for storing beans long term. Now I mentioned that I use the 5-gallon bucket method. That is not the only way to store dried beans. You can certainly store them in half-gallon mason jars and vacuum seal them. That's an excellent method. I would not store them in plastic bags, and I personally don't like storing them in Mylar. That's a controversial, subject, but I have stored freeze-dried foods in Mylar, and I can taste a very weird, almost tinny, aluminum-y type aftertaste to it. So I just avoid Mylar. That's my personal opinion. Okay, so storing in dried or 5-gallon buckets. Anytime that you're going to be storing dried beans, I have maybe a little bit of a different opinion. Now there is plenty of ways to spend money in food storage, but I am a heavy proponent of let's save those resources for foods that really need them. Beans really don't need them. They are not prone to many of the food degradation things that can happen with other foods, like your home dehydrated foods or your sugars or your freeze-dried foods, things like that. Beans are really hardy and they are not the primary target of pests. So for that reason, I don't spend a lot of money on my dried beans. There are 3 things that I do, but honestly, I could do without 2 of them and only do the one. So first is the absolute necessary thing that I consider, and that is to swap out the flimsy 5-gallon bucket lid with a Gamma Seal lid. What this does is it just gives you more of that airtight seal because it screws down. Those flimsy lids, if you have ever used those before, they are not airtight whatsoever, and bugs, if they were to be drawn to your beans, which they likely aren't going to be, if they were, they could get in pretty easily with those flimsy lids. Or they can sprout if they're already inside of them. Sprout, grow if they're already inside there. That typically happens though more with flours, pastas, and rice. So not as much of a concern with or bug larvae that are already inside your product. Growing, not as much as concern with dried beans. But so that is my non-negotiable, is swapping out the lid. Now here's the other 2 things that I do. I use food grade diatomaceous earth in any food storage products that need to be rinsed before using anyway. So it's like, why not? It's cheap. It is multi-purpose. We store this on our property for many uses. It is great for chickens. It is great for naturally protecting cats and dogs against fleas. It's just great for so many things. And if you purchase food grade, then you can use it on your food as well as with your chickens or your animals and things like that. So what I do is I sprinkle just a little bit as I'm pouring it into the 5-gallon bucket. I'll get like a wooden spoon or something, stir it around, and get it nicely coated in the diatomaceous earth. What this does is, if you're not familiar with food grade diatomaceous earth, it is basically the crushed shells of fossilized little creatures. If you look at it under a microscope, it looks like broken glass. And what this does is it will basically not shred, but cut, poke, make it very uncomfortable for bugs that are on it. It's another great use out in the garden. Flea beetles hate this stuff, so I will sprinkle this on things like peppers, tomatoes. I'm getting off topic, but I'm just telling you this stuff is very multi-purpose. That's why I do use it, because I already have it on hand. Now I mentioned that I really only had 1 non-negotiable, which is the Gamma Seal lid, and then the 2 other things, the diatomaceous earth is the second one, and the only reason that it's not non-negotiable is that I wouldn't spend money on dried beans, because again, they are hardy. Let's save those resources and put those towards other things that are not as hardy as dried beans are. but I have this on hand in bulk anyway, so that's why I go ahead and use it. Okay, so the third thing is bay leaves. Bay leaves are kind of your perimeter defense for dried beans and really anything that you're going to be storing in 5-gallon buckets. I go ahead and get a big bucket like this. I got it on Amazon. I will try to find this one and link it below, but any kind of bay leaves is fine. They are highly aromatic and pests do not like the smell of it. So what I do is, do I have any on here right now? No, this is a pretty old bucket. But what I do is I just sprinkle a few bay leaves inside the Degassing lid of the bucket. I cannot get this open. There we go. Nope. Still having trouble. There we go. Whew, that smell. I love the smell of bay leaves, and it is such a strong smell. These are 2 years old, and they are still extremely aromatic. And that's really the only thing that you need to consider if you're trying to figure out, are my bay leaves too old, or have they lost their efficacy. Just smell them. If they smell really strong, bugs are still going to hate them. But I just take a handful and put them inside the little compartments of the 5-gallon Degassing lid. And that's just going to be basically a perimeter fence around your 5-gallon buckets. But pests are going to smell that and not want to have anything to do with it. Again, I wouldn't spend money specifically on bay leaves for dried beans, but also, again, I store them in bulk anyway, so they're on hand, so I use them. So that is my 3-step kind of thing that I do for dried beans. Now, we store beans in bulk like this because I consider beans a must-have in a food storage pantry for their ability to stretch meals and provide a plant-based protein. If you're getting into food storage and would like a roadmap for what to buy and how much, we've done the calculations for you inside our free 1-year food storage plan that helps you grocery shop normally with just adding a few extra items each week. That link will be in the description box, or you can comment food storage and I'll reply to your comment with a direct link to access. Now let's talk about how I rotate through my bean storage, and that is with basically a 2-bucket method. So for every item that I have in my long-term storage pantry, I have 2 buckets for them. One is for active use and one is for the backup waiting to be refilled. This is super simple. All I do is I monitor the line or how much I have inside bucket number 1, and when I get to about a quarter left, I will go ahead and know that I need to order beans, and they will go in this bucket so that I'm not pouring new food on top of old food. That's just a principle in food storage rotation, is to always pull the old food and have the new food in the back. That can be hard to achieve with 5-gallon buckets, because if you wait until, or if you order when it's right here and then you order new and then you just keep one bucket, you're pouring the new on top of the old. But then also, you don't really want to wait until you're completely out to order more, because something could happen and you're left with no beans. So a second bucket just allows me to continue having this untainted by any new products, which would bury the old product, and then it allows me to never fully run out before I order more. So I hope that makes sense. I monitor bucket number 1. When it gets to quarter of the way, I go ahead and purchase more, fill up bucket number 2, and then I'll use this, and this will then become my empty bucket. This will become my empty bucket. This is now filled with fresh beans, and this is on standby waiting until this bucket gets a quarter of the way and I can refill in this bucket, okay? Now let's talk about degassing your beans. We all know that beans can make you gassy, okay? So let's solve that problem. So there are 3 primary ways to degas your beans. You can choose to do just one method or stack all 3 for maximum impact. The first method to degas your beans is to simply soak them overnight. Now you saw the diatomaceous earth on my beans, and so I just gave those a good rinse before, just to get all of that diatomaceous earth off, even though it's food grade, so it wouldn't hurt you. If you ate it, I just prefer to go ahead and get all that off. So first we're going to soak them overnight, and you're basically just going to cover them until they have about 1 inch of water on top of them. This is a great process to do at night before you go to bed. Let them soak overnight, and then the next morning, come back and do the next step. Now let's pretend that these beans have soaked overnight. One thing that you will notice, there's already some that are floating. The next step is to drain this water, but first go ahead and look for any floating items. Those are beans that are typically bad. They may not be bad in like the traditional spoiled sense bad, but they might be split already, or they might have some air pockets in them that's causing them to float. They may just not be ideal. So especially if you are canning, you really want ideal beans. If you're, just going to be eating them fresh, it's not that big of a deal. But once you soak overnight, you then want to go ahead and drain off the soaking water. And what this does is get rid of a lot of the starches and stuff that are in the beans that can cause gassiness. Now, after you have soaked them overnight and drained them, you can move on to step 2. Now, step 2 could be just cook them on your stovetop like you normally would, and then you are only using one step to degas them. Or you can stack step 1 and step 2 and help degas them even further. So step 2 is to use a pressure cooker. I know not everybody has a pressure cooker, so like I said, go ahead and just do them straight on your stovetop. You can also take advantage of method number 3, which we'll talk about in just a minute, but stacking all 3 of these is really kind of the ultimate way to degas beans. So to pressure cook dried beans, you're going to, like I said, rinse them off. Make sure don't use the same water that you use to soak them in, which kind of defeats the purpose of degassing them. Go make sure you use fresh water. At this point, you can season your beans however you like. I typically do salt, garlic powder, and onion powder, but have fun with it. And fill them up with fresh water until they are submerged by at least 4 inches. Some people go all the way to 6 inches. I'm going to add several more to this, and I'll show you the water line. Okay, here we are. So I've got several inches of water submerged by the black beans, making sure that I don't go over the fill line, which you can't see it, but it's right over here. Making sure that we don't go over the fill line of our pressure cooker. Now the next step is extremely important, and that is to put a splash of oil inside your beans. About a tablespoon. I typically don't measure, but about a tablespoon for 1 load of your pressure cooker. The reason we add the oil is because pressure cooked beans have a tendency to foam, and to foam big time. And we don't want to risk the foam coming up and blocking our vent right here, which could be very dangerous. So in order to prevent foaming, that's why we add a little bit of olive oil. It can be any oil. I said olive oil, but it can be any kind of oil. Avocado, if you use canola or vegetable, it can be any of those things. The oil helps prevent the foaming. I don't really fully understand the science of that, but I know it works. And go ahead and turn your little vent pipe thing to airtight, and then we can process. Now, beans need to process for different times according to what size bean that they are. We're doing black beans today, so we're going to put it on for 25 minutes. And I will put up a chart for how long to do each of the bean types as soon as I get this going. Okay. Here are the times for several of the most common type of beans. So black beans and black-eyed peas need to pressure cook for about 25 minutes. Northern, navy, pinto, and kidney beans need to pressure cook for 30 minutes. Finally, cannellini and chickpeas need to pressure cook for 40 minutes. Okay, so we talked about method number 1, which is just pre-soaking overnight. Method number 2, pressure cooking. Now the third and final method for degassing your beans is going to be to pre-sprout them before cooking with them. Now I don't have footage to show you this exact process, but I do have my little thing here that I'll show you how we use it. So to pre-sprout beans is a 2 to 3 day process, so you really do have to plan ahead if you want to use this method, but it is probably the best and most effective way to degas your beans. So what you do, all you need is a mason jar lid that is a screen instead of a solid lid like your typical lids. Now a lot of bean sprouting kits will come with, I think they're more marketed for microgreens. I will try to find a set of these for you, but many of them come with a stand, but I have since learned that a bowl works just as good. So let me show you what I mean by having a bowl to do this process. Okay, I'm going to be able to demonstrate kind of the steps in the process for you, but then we'll have to use our imaginations and just pretend like we see sprouts. Okay, so the very first step is to soak your beans essentially just like you would if you were doing step 1. So you just want to cover the beans to where they are completely submerged. I'm just doing a very small amount here because this is just for demonstration purposes. But instead of doing it in a bowl, you're going to do it in a mason jar with one of these screens. You're going to screw that on and let this sit overnight. You can do this on, it's typically going to be dark in your house, I assume, at night, so you can just leave this out on the counter. You don't have to put it in like a really dark place. When you're doing microgreens, it's a little bit different, but we're focused on beans today. So you can just set this out on your counter overnight. Now, let's pretend it's the next morning. So you're just going to give them a good rinse, and this is where the screen comes in really handy. You don't need to drain them in a separate strainer. Just give them a good rinse, swish it around, strain. Let's do this maybe 2 or 3 more times. We'll just do it 2 more times, but you can do 2 to 3 more times for when you're doing this in real life. For example purposes, let's just do it twice. Now during the day, you're going to turn them upside down and place them in a bowl just like that. It's going to allow the beans to stay a little bit moist, but not really sit in a bunch of water. The bowl is going to be there to catch the water that drips out. Now before you go to bed on night 2, you're going to take your beans, fill it up with water until they're completely submerged, and set them on your counter again. The next morning, you're going to rinse them out, do what we just did, flip them upside down, let them hang out on your kitchen counter. Now, you should have sprouts by the end of day 2. Every now and then it will take 3 days, but you're just going to repeat those 2 steps of refilling, draining, hanging out on your counter, refilling and letting them soak overnight, drain on your counter during the day until you have sprouts. Once they are sprouted, they are properly degassed. Okay, moving right along, let's talk about how to revive old, stale beans. So dried beans do not spoil in the traditional sense in your long-term food storage pantry, but they do go stale. And when dried beans go stale, they will not soften no matter how long you soak or cook them. You can simmer for 3-4 hours and they will still not soften much, not at least to soften to the point of being pleasantly edible. But there is a very simple solution, and all you need to do is add baking soda to your soaking water when you soak them overnight. So this does require an overnight soak, which again requires some pre-planning and thinking ahead. But if you have dry, stale beans, all you need to do is add a quarter teaspoon, between a quarter teaspoon and half a teaspoon of baking soda per pound of dried beans. Go ahead and put that in your soaking water, let it soak overnight, drain just like we normally did, and then move forward with however you want to cook them, whether on your stovetop or in a pressure cooker. And that really is it. I don't fully understand the science of it, but I believe the baking soda changes the alkalinity of this soaking water, which helps to break down the cell wall of the dried beans skin. If y'all have ever seen beans peel, you know that they have a skin around them, and it is actually the skin that has hardened, not really the inside of the bean itself. And the baking soda addition helps to break down the cell wall of that skin. It's pretty interesting. Okay, now let's talk pretty quickly about how to can dried beans. Now there are 2 ways to do this. One is the USDA tried, tested, proven safe way. The other way is considered Rebel. Now we walk a very fine line on this channel between canning safety and Rebel. We lean very, very heavily towards canning safety, but we also know that seasoned preservers, seasoned canners, if they understand the science of canning safety and not just go by the rules, but really understand the why behind the rules, then we know that there are some workarounds and things that we can do while still remaining safe. If you are brand new to canning, I highly recommend only sticking 100% to the National Center for Home Food Preservation's canning guidelines and not deviating from them at all, because as you can, according to those guidelines, you are essentially learning what is safe and what is not safe. If you have been canning for years and years, you understand the why behind the rules, then maybe you're okay with method number 2. So let's go ahead and start with the USDA guidelines for canning dried beans. First, you're going to sort your beans, remove any rocks or split or discolored beans. We really want to use highest quality as possible when canning. Next, measure half a cup of dried beans per pint jar. Soak the beans in water on the counter overnight. The USDA guidelines do require an overnight pre-soak. The next morning, discard any beans that floated to the top. Drain and rinse the beans really well, and then cover again with fresh water, at least 2 inches, and boil for 30 minutes. Now, when I say at least 2 inches, I mean completely submerged by at least 2 inches of water. Bring to a boil and boil for 30 minutes straight. Then drain and rinse them. Now you're ready to prep your jars and your canner. Beans are a low acid food and must be pressure canned. So follow the instructions for your particular canner for how to prepare it, but most say to add 3 quarts of water to the bottom of your pressure canner. Make sure your rack is in the bottom. Next, fill your jars halfway with water and warm them inside your canner as it warms up. Or, alternatively, you can run your jars through the dishwasher with the heat cycle while you're prepping everything else. The goal here is just to have warm jars, no matter how you achieve that. So once the jars are warm, dump the water if needed. If you use a dishwasher, you don't have to do that. But if there's water in your jars, dump them before filling, of course. Next, add half a teaspoon of canning salt. Now remember, canning salt is just plain non-iodized salt. You want to add half a teaspoon per pint. You can also leave this out if you prefer. Next, ladle in your beans, filling the jar up to 1 inch headspace. And then you're going to top with hot water, also to 1 inch headspace. Go ahead and debubble, wipe your rims, and apply lids to fingertip tight. You're going to pressure can pints for 75 minutes or 90 minutes if you're canning in quarts. This is going to be at 11 pounds of pressure. Be sure to adjust for your elevation if you live higher than 2,000 feet above sea level. Let the pressure come down naturally and completely to zero. Never move your pressure canner during this stage. Then let your jars sit undisturbed, well, take them out of the canner and then let them sit on a counter undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. You're going to, before you put them on your shelf, check your lids, make sure they have sealed. You'll know by the little button popper thing in the center of the lid. It will be suctioned down, not popped up. If any jars didn't seal, go ahead and put them in the refrigerator and enjoy them within a week. Then go ahead and label with your date and store them on your shelf. Now let's talk about the so-called rebel way. I do personally can my beans this way, and it is because I have taken the time to really deep dive into the research and understand the safety behind why the USDA requires pre-soaking the beans overnight before canning. It's all about how much water the beans take up and soak and how much water is left during the canning process, most importantly, and then after the canning process. But it really matters how much water there is during the canning process because it is directly related to heat circulation, heat penetration, and making sure the beans in the center of the jar are the same temperature. I was looking for my canning jar. Making sure the beans right here get as high of a temperature as the beans on the outside of the jar, and water plays a critical role in that. That's why dry canning is not recommended. I don't do it. Side note. Okay, so doing dried beans this way, if we know that that's the reason why we need to pre-soak the beans first, according to the guidelines, then we can make sure that our solids to water ratio is very, very high to accommodate for maximum absorption rate of the beans during the canning process. So basically what that boils down to is make sure you have way more water than you do beans, and the guideline for that is half a cup of dried beans per jar. Now, this changes a little bit according to how big your bean size is. If you have very big beans, you want to decrease that all the way down to maybe a quarter cup per pint jar or half a cup per quart jar. But for most of your beans, that would be for kidney beans and cannellini beans. They're just very large beans in general. But for your regular standard type of beans, black beans, pinto beans, navy beans, those kind of things, your traditional just white beans, half a cup of dried beans per pint jar is the guideline, and you do not want to extend past that. Now, there is a little bit of a trade-off. When you are following the USDA guidelines, you do get more beans per jar. And so if you're trying to maximize how many beans you're able to put into a jar, use the USDA guidelines. And remember, if you're new, go ahead and use those anyway. But that's one of those trade-offs that we're going to trade off time for a little bit less beans inside the jar. And the reason why there's less beans inside the jar is because we are being extremely careful with our solid to water ratios to keep the canning process safe. Beans soak up a ton of liquid when they are cooked and when they are canned. And when they're canned, when you're canning them dried, they haven't soaked up any water yet, right? All of that happens inside the jar, and we need to provide a lot of water to make sure that there's plenty of water and heat penetration happening throughout the entire canning process. Some people push the limits and do 3/4 cup of beans to 1 cup of beans. I do not recommend that because the beans will soak up to almost full of the jar, and that is getting into dangerous territory of not having enough water. You're not guaranteed to get that heat penetration to the center of the jar if you increase how much of the dried beans. So I never go past 1/2 cup of dried beans inside of a pint jar, which doubles to 1 cup of beans in a quart jar. But I typically just can in pints because this is the closest size to your typical store-bought can of beans, and a lot of recipes call for 1 can of beans, which translates to 1 pint of beans. Okay, I hope that was helpful to y'all. I tried to kind of stuff in everything that I know about working with dried beans and storing them and degassing them and canning them and all of that. I hope that was helpful to you. If you would like the full-blown step-by-step tutorial for how to can dried beans, go ahead and check out the video that just popped up on your screen. That's all for today. We'll see you next time. Bye.